Good morning. I'm honored to be here on behalf of Wells Fargo to introduce our next panel of speakers who will be discussing how the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference will be an opportunity to strengthen international commitments to address climate change. Wells Fargo is leading the charge on the race to zero, both here in LA and across the nation. We have been working closely with LABC, including supporting LABC Institute's multi-year environmental justice and clean energy initiative in the high-need communities of Pacoima and Sun Valley to bring much-needed clean energy, new jobs, and financial investment to the area. Beyond LA, Wells Fargo recently announced its goal to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, including financed emissions, and to deploy $500 billion in financing to sustainable businesses and projects between 2021 and 2030. Just last month, we announced an issuance of a $1 billion inclusive climate communities bond, which will fund projects and programs that support housing, affordability, socioeconomic opportunity, and renewable energy. I'm very pleased and grateful to have the opportunity to introduce this outstanding group of leaders joining us for the panel featuring Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, Dr. Carol Folt, President of the University of Southern California, and Nigel Topping, the UK government's high-level climate champion. Mayor Garcetti has focused his agenda on creating a safe, livable, and prosperous city. As mayor, he has shown a deep commitment to building a resilient and sustainable Los Angeles through the city's Green New Deal plan and has worked tirelessly to expand that vision across cities nationwide. In addition to the city's Green New Deal plan, under his leadership, Los Angeles has passed the nation's largest transportation infrastructure plan, become the #1 solar city in America, and installed over 11,000 commercial EV chargers, become the leading clean tech job hub in California, and moved toward a goal of achieving 100% renewable energy by 2035. Mayor Garcetti currently serves as the chair of the C40 Cities, which connects cities to take bold climate action, leading the way towards a healthier and more sustainable future. As chair of C40, he has garnered the support of more than 700 cities to reach net zero by 2050. In all these ways, Mayor Garcetti has prioritized climate change and promoted a green economy as a critical part of our city's future. We're also fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Carol L. Folt, who serves as the 12th president of the University of Southern California. She is a highly experienced leader, internationally recognized life scientist, and award-winning teacher. In leading USC, Dr. Folt brings a broad executive and leadership experience across the academy, and including arts and sciences, professional schools, and academic medicine. Throughout her career, Dr. Folt has earned a reputation for always placing students at the center, advancing academic excellence and innovation, setting ambitious goals, prioritizing shared governance, and focusing on the future. We're also fortunate to be joined by Nigel Topping, who is the high-level climate champion for the UK government. In this role, he is tasked with expanding NGO support for the Paris Climate Agreement and Race to Zero. Nigel Topping was the CEO of We Mean Business until December 2019, where he drove radical collaboration for climate action amongst NGOs working with the world's most influential businesses. This coalition played a key role in bringing the constructive voice of business in support of the Paris Agreement, and under Nigel's leadership has continued to drive ambition and action to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Dan Mazmanian, chair of USC's Presidential Working Group on Sustainability and professor of public policy at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. Dr. Mazmanian served as the director of Governor Schwarzenegger's task force on California's adaptation to climate change in 2009 and 2010, and skillfully led multiple task forces on environmental policy for the People's Republic of China from 2005 to 2016. So please welcome Mayor Garcetti, USC President Carol Folt, Nigel Topping, and Dr. Mazmanian.
Well, Greg, thank you very much. And we are extremely fortunate to have with us today these three distinguished leaders in sustainability and climate change to share their insights and respective roles in this process. And let's begin right away with Nigel, if I can turn to you to start us off. Please help us understand what COP stands for, and why 26?
Yeah, it's a good question. We should make sure we don't confuse everyone with the acronym. So COP stands for the Conference of the Parties. So it's the United Nations Conference of Parties, means countries, so parties to the United Nations Climate Convention. They happen annually to progress negotiations on the global climate treaty. And this is the 26th one, which is why it's called COP26. And it's particularly important because it's the 5th COP since the breakthrough Paris Agreement at COP21 in Paris in 2015. And that Paris Agreement sets a 5-yearly cycle of ratcheted plans from national government. So the reason that Glasgow is so important, which is where COP26 is going to be in November, is it's really the first test of the Paris Agreement. It's the first test of the multilateral treaty on climate change.
Well, thank you. That is very important. And what is your role as high-level climate action champion, which is, by the way, is an impressive title?
It's an impressively long title, at least. So in Paris, the parties, the countries, recognize that tackling the climate crisis is so complex that it's going to take a whole of society approach. I was working with the business community then, and of course, the city mayors were becoming a very important voice, at the sharp end with lots of powers to implement. So the parties in Paris said, you know what, we need to find a way to keep the voice of business and cities and investors and banks and universities and everyone, what they call non-state actors, in the room. So not in the legal negotiations, but in the informal process around it, where lots of the real economy action happens. So they created the role of high-level climate action champions. And my role is to work with that community, with the C40, with Women in Business, with many other coalitions, to drive ambition and action. And that's why we've created the race to zero, to try and get as many people as possible to commit to getting to zero, and a race to resilience to make sure we're tackling the adaptation needs as well.
Well, that's why we're here today, actually, and why we have Mayor Garcia and Dr. Paul with us. But let me back up just a moment. What are the top priorities for COP26?
Well, as I said, it's the first test of the Paris Agreement. So the UK government, which holds the incoming presidency, they'll take over formally on the first day, has set 4 priorities. The first is to keep 1.5 degrees alive as something that we can still have a hope to reach. We're not on track by a long way at the moment. We've got stronger pledges coming in, but that's the first, is to make sure that we're still on track to a global net zero landing. The second goal is to make sure we make significant move on adaptation. So recognizing that we've already got over a degree of warming, there's more coming. Many of the most vulnerable communities in the world who have had the least to do with causing it need help in adapting. I hope we're going to hear some more from the mayor about the way that the mayor has put both resilience and mitigation at the heart of plans. And I think that's a really important to make sure it's not just about getting to zero, but in an equitable way. So we're taking care of resilience as well. There's a finance element. There's a commitment. I hope we'll hear more at the G7 summit, which President Biden is on his way to at the moment, about the rich countries meeting their pledge of getting to $100 billion a year of finance for those countries who are least developed and have got the biggest problem and the least resources to deal with it. We're also trying to make sure that private finance is mobilized as well. And then the fourth commitment is what I call the solidarity goal, to make sure this really is a moment when the world comes together and collaborates. National governments, state governments, city governments, public sector, private sector, grassroots, top down, global north, global south. We really need a year. We're all coming through the end of, or still in the middle of, a terrible year in terms of the pandemic, and we really need a moment of global solidarity. So collaboration will be the fourth marker of success of the COP in November.
You're telling us an awful lot in a short time, which is really appreciated. But there's one last question about this. So what do you mean by race to zero?
Well, the science is really clear that we have to get to zero emissions. We say net zero because we know there's some bits of the economy, like livestock, that emit emissions that we don't know how to reduce. So we need to take some emissions out of the atmosphere at the same time. But we basically need to get to zero, and we need to get there fast. The science says we need to at least halve emissions by the end of this decade, and we haven't even bent the curve yet. So the race is a campaign to get every city, every business, every bank, every university to commit to that long-term goal of zero by 2050 at the latest. We like people coming in earlier, and to then put in place plans to deliver that first wave in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's the race to zero.
So let me pick up on that and turn to Mayor Garcetti. And how does the city, and particularly Los Angeles, fit into what Nigel has just described?
Well, thank you, Dan, and great to be with you. And thank you so much, Nigel, for your great words, and another champion, even if she doesn't have the title, Carol, great to be with you as well. Look, we're very excited in Los Angeles, and I think in cities in general, to be giving hope to this movement and to be giving proof points that it can be done. I wear the hat of both being the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, but also as the chair of C40 Cities, together with 2 or 3 other global networks of cities. Right now, the 100 biggest cities of the world, which comprise our organization, over half of them have met or exceeded our Paris commitments. Contrast that with 2 countries in the world, Morocco and the Gambia, and that's it. So I know it's immensely difficult. It's not just a criticism of national governments. They have to pull together people everywhere. But it shows that you can, in a complicated economy like a Los Angeles, figure out a way to bring economic prosperity, equity, and ecological progress hand in hand together. Here in Los Angeles, for instance, in a single year, we reduced our emissions by 11% when we closed down a coal plant. And now, recently, California, there was one day 93% of our power came from renewable sources during the middle of the day. We've got to continue to push forward on that. And I'm very grateful to the UK presidency for making me a friend of the COP. I've always considered myself a friend of COPs. Now I'm a friend of COP. So as part of this advisory group to the UK presidency, in my capacity representing both Los Angeles and C40, we want to bring those unique perspectives of city. And in terms of race to zero, probably the most ambitious goal and maybe the biggest announcement that'll come out of the COP is at least 1,000 cities globally in every continent, global North, global South, from Africa to the Americas, Oceania, Asia, Europe, and North America will figure out a way to make kind of a Paris 2.0 pledge and an accountable way. Here in Los Angeles, we will hit halving our emissions by 2030. In fact, we were saying with our energy production alone, with our Department of Water and Power, we'll be at 97% emissions-free, carbon-free by the end of this decade in just 8.5 years. So it shows it can be done, it must be done, and we're very excited to show cities leading the way to inspire national action as well.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Folt, and you made sustainability a top priority for USC, and where does USC fit into this discussion, and what difference can one university make?
Well, I'm so excited to be part of this panel. And yes, I am trying to get that champion name, like Nigel. And of course, Mayor Garcetti is absolutely a champion for climate. It was so exciting for me to come back to California because all of my PhD research had been in California. And I was thinking as we were talking that the first grant I got on climate change was in 1992. The reason I feel so optimistic for how universities are going to be able to be really important and key drivers of what's happening in climate change right now is that we are in partnerships with cities and governments. In 1992, the scientists were raising all sorts of concerns about climate. It was happening all the time. We were talking about it, but it didn't get traction, and it won't get traction until we work together. So I love the title of this upcoming conference, Working Together. For me, having the fact that we're working with the mayor, we're working across sectors, means that we can do what we do really well with a real speed and a scale. So we have to bring education to this. We need to be part of the training of people, the making sure that people understand it. We can bring incredible discovery-based research in clean energy, in better health disparities, all of these aspects that are very research oriented, but we can do them now in partnership with people at the city, in local environments. We've got businesses now more than they ever did even 10 years ago. It just was not happening like we're seeing now as we're seeing Greg getting involved. People want to make these coalitions of the willing really be effective and very, very pronounced. Then you add the last magic to that, the young generation is so incredibly fired toward this that they aren't going to let us stop. So if universities are going to do it well, Dan, not only do we have to talk about it, but we need to start by making our own campuses very great testing beds. And I know we'll come back to this, but USC is one of the only major research universities in the heart of a city. Nobody else has our location right in the center of LA. So if we're going to help LA, we've got to walk the walk ourselves. We got lots of things going there. We've got to get our faculty and our students and our local neighbors all a part of it. And this is where that real move towards collaboration on warp speed is what makes me feel amazingly optimistic and a part of being with you as we try to get our full huge communities all working in that direction. And having that COP26 there as a marker is a wonderful point to aim for some good outcomes.
Well, thank all three of you. And now I would like to delve into a couple of related issues that, of course, are going to affect, I presume, the COP, but of course, all of us. And I think it's clear to everyone, at least by now, that in the new Biden era, we have a federal administration that takes sustainability and climate change and the implications for social impacts quite seriously. So I'd like to dwell with you on what that means now for all of us. And let's start with Mayor Garcia. What are the implications for cities like Los Angeles and your Green New Deal?
Well, it means that we're not fighting Washington, we're working with Washington. Let me tell you what a welcome development that is. You know, it's funny that while President Trump became the only leader of a country in the world to threaten to withdraw from Paris, in the meantime, we didn't kind of cry in a corner. I was co-founder and co-chair of Climate Mayors, which is the US group of mayors across the country. We just said, if he's out, we're in. And suddenly we had 10 and then 50 and then 100 and then 200. Over 300 cities in every state in this country that were able to say, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, we will continue the work. And so the national work continued, but it was always at headwinds in Washington. Now we have, Gina McCarthy, we've got John Kerry, we've got people who have seen how important this is and are traveling the world to reestablish America's co-authorship of this work. But secondly, a recognition that we who are the subnational actors, whether it's cities and states, I was just recently on a call with Minister Xie, who heads up China's climate work, and the US-China Climate Leaders Summit, which happened here in Los Angeles, was mayors of cities and governors of provinces and states who made some of the most historic agreements in the world before Paris. We've got to start that up again. So we have a Washington committed to doing that work. We also have a Washington committed to helping us with the technical side. In order to get to 100% renewable, Department of Water and Power, we work with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and their supercomputers to run millions of scenarios to show we could get there to that 97% by the end of the decade, and certainly by 2035 to hit President Biden's bold goal of making electricity generation carbon neutral. So we will be able to get there and do that. And so it's like having friends leading and giving us now, wind at our back instead of at our front.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Full, I would like to ask you the same about USC and universities. It's a new era, a new administration, and how does that affect, or how do you imagine it's going to affect, the attitude of students toward this, the ability to do the research you've spoken to, and actually the operations of our campus?
Well, I think what the mayor said is really true. We now have a very different set of things being said about climate change. It's a tenor of the conversation nationally. That is always very exciting for people. But I think also, like the mayor said, it's not like people weren't continuing to work on this and they will always be working on this now. People have become energized, but we've got people with new ideas. It's always exciting when a new administration comes in anyway, because they bring in a chance to really let's get things going. I think that is really true. One of the things I think universities have to do, because we're big institutions. USC is, if not one of the largest private employers in all of Los Angeles. And our job is to expand the tent. I want everybody in Los Angeles to see a place for their view under the tent of sustainability. That's what we get to do. We get to think about, how does that affect health? How does it affect shade in your local neighborhood? How does it affect whether your children even have good transportation. So we have an opportunity to be the arbiters of the actions, the resilience, and the actions that are taken with the faculty, the staff, with the people that we put in place to run schools and all those things. So we have a wonderful role to play that is going to expand the perspective. So sustainability becomes something anybody can see as part of their goal for the future. I think everything has changed just in the last year about that, in part because of a change in administration, but also because of the rise of the youth movement and also the DEI movements that are fueling this synthesis between social well-being, education, health gaps, and sustainability, the sustenance of the planet. So it is an amazing moment for us.
So Nigel, at that point, I'd like to loop back to you and how you view, you're at a distance now from us, how you view President Biden's effect on the conversation at COP26 in general, and expectations or demands that you could imagine will now be on US to do more in reducing our own carbon footprint, as well as reaching across the planet.
Well, I mean, I don't think you can exaggerate the impact of the US coming back into the Paris Agreement under President Biden's leadership. It's transformational. I mean, when you have the biggest economy in the world, I'm thinking of, the cultural capital of the world in some ways, right? In terms of California, I'm looking at you guys now. You set a tone, drive investment, drive innovation. Have done for decades. Have been really dependable in that. When you have that voice withdrawn from the multilateral system, it's kind of catastrophic, right? So to have the American voice back around the table, and not just the American voice, but you mentioned some of the team that the president's put together: John Kerry, Gene McCarthy, and there's a whole roster of stars who've been working in the detail of how to transform economies for many years, which is one of the things which I think has allowed this administration to hit the ground running. The other thing has been, as the mayor says, there's been this whole movement of non-state actors, cities, states, universities, businesses who've kept moving forward to the extent that they could with some federal headwinds. So it's huge. It completely changes the tone. The UK has agreed to move to 100% electric vehicles by 2030. The UK is not a big enough market to set the tone for the whole world. When California says 2035, and hopefully the federal government says 2035, and then Europe copies, then China, then the whole world, the combustion engine is dead in the mid-30s. So it's really huge. It's changed the politics, it's changed the market signals, and it's changed the sense of possibility that we have now coming into COP26.
This all sounds quite actually exciting and ambitious. And thinking about that ambitious part of it, there's the reality of delivering. So I just want to go back to the three of you and pose a broad question. Maybe start with Nigel, which is, what new roles do you see for the subnational actors, such as cities and the private sector and higher education, in achieving the aspirations that you imagine, you can imagine at least, or have surely been thinking about, that will be forthcoming from COP26 that are now new and truly demanding?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much that there's a new role. I think it's that the role that was envisioned for these non-state actors in Paris is really come to fruition. And so I think that in Paris, the voice of mayors and CEOs was important in lending an atmosphere of sort of can-do and positivity. But I think now it's much more about being the agents of implementation, being the vectors for change. So it's not just influencing policy, which is important, but it's also then being the entities who are actually delivering on the ground. So when the mayor talks about 97%, that's not an influence of someone else, that's direct action that the city's taking. When Carol talks about the way the university is becoming an exemplar of change, not just an influencer of future generations, it's both and, right? So I think this is the coming of age of the non-state actor as the direct agent of accelerated implementation of climate action, which was always envisioned, but it's really happening now.
So your comment actually brings us why we're having this panel. Your comments right now bring us to why we're having these panels. I think because in fact, the challenge is not just at nation states and thinking abstractly, it's on the ground, it's walking the talk, and Dr. Folk mentioned that, and Mayor Garcia has walked that, but maybe I want to loop back to them and see either one, if you'd like to comment on how you see what you're doing in terms of this walking the talk that's going to be important for us, especially for the audience, as our city moves forward, as our university, not just ours, but universities move forward in this, either one of you.
Carol, you want to jump in first?
Sure, I'll jump in. I love that question because I'm going to talk about the tent. And of course, we've got an 80,000 person tent. You have a many million person tent. But I do think we can be exemplars, not only of the research, the technology, the health fields. I mean, we're great at that. We know that. We have to be better at it. People trust the research aspect of our mission. But what about our artists? What about our social scientists? What about our historians who have enormously important voices to bring to this, that start reaching out and helping the social drivers that are necessary to have this really be embedded in the community? It's a place that the universities are on the ground with every kid we educate, every person that comes to our door, and every partnership we make in our local communities. So I think we have a big role there in bringing that tent along. And I love to see that role be fueled by all the optimism and excitement that I'm hearing from the mayor and from Nigel.
Well, I would just add from the city's perspective that it is this exciting moment because we're not only at the table. I mean, the UN has formalized that. I bring together mayors regularly for not a quick interaction, but an hour and a half listening session for the UN Secretary General. UK has granted us 1.5 days that are just going to be around cities. The Race to Zero we kind of share, and then later on in the COP, a day just about cities and the actions. And I think it's because, and don't take this the wrong way if you're a national leader, national governments don't do much. They are critical leaders, funders, and policymakers. But the implementation falls on all of us. A national government is there to make sure we get certain things taken care of, but then we have to do everything. So it's like a building, they're the architects and the developers, but then a whole bunch of engineers and construction workers, human beings with their hands, have to actually raise a building from the ground, have to procure the materials, have to make sure the pieces fit together, have to make sure it has structural integrity, et cetera. And that's essentially what cities are about: transportation networks, electricity and energy generation, building codes, water transportation. And on top of that, we have to care about the health of our people in the midst of that. And I hope that coming out of COVID, which for most of the world, they're not coming out of, just to remind ourselves, but for UK, the US, where we look and we can see that in our rearview mirror, I hope the lessons of COVID, of public health, we've never been better educated about public health in our lives, that we take that into climate, because it is a public health emergency that really affects our lives. This isn't about the gigatons of emissions. This is about how long we live, who we are able to connect with, and what sort of tragedies we have to confront where we live due to climate change. And if we keep that focus in a human way, then I think that subnational actors will continue to be the ones that save the world.
If I may pursue that just a moment, because I'm sure there are many people watching are very excited about this. Could you give us an example or two of how you are affecting people in doing this in the city?
Sure. I mean, look at 15 new rapid transit lines being built or extended, the most in US history, thanks to voters in Measure M. You don't see things always overnight, but think about what LA will look like when the Olympics and Paralympics come and how radically transformed that will be. Recycling 100% of our water. We have movies made like Chinatown about us stealing water from Owens Valley, which helped this city grow. But imagine recycling enough water to be 3 times bigger than the LA aqueduct and supply, just by recycling what we have in Hyperion and not needing energy to transport that water from other states or other parts of our state. Look at the bus lanes and the bike lanes that we're expanding. Get the feel for the building codes, then buildings that one day may not have carbon emissions coming from them at all. Those are things that are concrete, they're real, they're right here. And if we do them right, there's jobs, there's gold in them there hills, about 10,000 new jobs, good jobs a year. So I always tell mayors and other subnational actors, if you're not doing this, you're losing jobs in your city. We're gonna make Los Angeles the transportation technology capital of the world. We have the technology for it, just as we had in the high desert for things like aerospace. We will do that, I believe, for transportation. So when you lead on these things, your economy prospers as well as your ecology.
Well, and then
And can I add one thing, Dan, about that? Because I love the list, just to talk about the importance of universities in every single one of those examples that the mayor gave. A major group of people at USC, researchers at USC, probably those at UCLA, Caltech, and others, have been really the worker bees coming up with a lot of that work together with the people at the city. And that also goes back to these things, our partnerships, who gets the work done, who comes up with those ideas and implements them, from transportation to health. I mean, all of those, I'm just thinking of all the great partnerships that we have going. So when a city and its great universities are really working together, it really is amazing what can be accomplished.
you know, I'd like to turn to another topic that we don't normally cover in a panel like this, but before I do so, because it's a personal one, but before I do so, any other comments that I want to loop back to Nigel, actually, because this is about COP26 and other things you want us to know in our city, in our community, where we can be of help or where you're imagining we can be, and what you, by the way, frankly, see about LA and its community is contributing to this.
Well, I think, I mean, Carol touched on this, right? That this is about the engineers and the architects and the construction workers, but this is also about the historians and the novelists, and so I think in every way, telling the story, you know, and by the way, both the mayor and Carol are great storytellers, right? They tell stories of the future. This is what you're telling the stories of today, but also painting pictures of the future that you're building, which is, it's compelling, right? It's like young people, everywhere I go, young people do not want to work for companies who are not bought into this vision of the future. Why do you want to work for a company that's screwing things up rather than building a better future for the world, right? So I think tell your story, right? Because you tell it with conviction and with facts and with the mistakes that you've made and the challenges you have to overcome. Because in many ways, this is a battle of two stories. You know, one story which says we don't need to do this, we can't do this, it'll be terrible. Another story which says we have to do this, we've got this, it's going to be great. Let's go there together. So, you know, LA is the storytelling capital amongst many other things. So tell the real stories about how exciting this is, because that's infectious, right? We need, you know, we've had a very negative experience of viral infection with the pandemic, but you know, we need enthusiasm and possibility and innovation to go viral globally, because we are running out of time here. And you know, the one thing that I would say that the world would be looking to the US of A to do is to up its ambition further on reducing by 50%. You know, Europe, the UK, and others have more ambitious plans, and I'm confident the USA will catch up and go further. I think that the sort of table stakes that have been laid down with 50% reduction are great, but you know, as the mayor's showing, you can go faster if you back our ability to collaborate and to innovate. So let's just keep backing ourselves to do this.
Mayor, Carol, Dr. Fold, any comments?
Well, I think, look, we're only held back right now at this moment by what we think is possible. And I think it is a tough emotional road to go down, because people do feel like the world is changing more quickly than we can change it. And when the scope of this is much bigger than trying to improve your university or your city, you can do a stellar job, and if the rest of the world doesn't do a stellar job, you're still screwed. And the communities that we're asking, oftentimes, who are bearing the brunt of this, are the ones who are not the chief emitters in other parts of the world, and they're asking to develop the way that UK and US has been able to. China makes this argument too, that they're just going through the same phase of our own industrial revolutions, and we have to let them get through this. But the crisis of this moment calls on all of us to really see, will this be a decade of action? Will this be a climate decade? And can we figure out a way to make our networks never broader and never stronger? In other words, we have to talk to every city in the world. C40 represents about 97 cities now, about a quarter of the world's GDP. We used to brag about that. I stay up at night thinking about the other 75% of towns and villages and cities in the world that are not part of C40, which is why the race to zero, when we looked at 1,000 cities, and we're already at 700 plus cities with 6 months to go or so before the COP, or 4 or 5 months to go, who have signed on. We have to think way beyond our narrow job descriptions and way beyond our jurisdictions to get there emotionally. And then secondly, we have to count the victories. I hope that people will see each time we do something, we might not feel that global climate change is being reduced, but know that this is the ultimate tipping point test. It really is, that every little bit counts. Our own consumption counts, the carbon footprint of our consumption counts, our organizational footprints count, our national footprints count. All of that has to be put and counted and looked at. And then there's hope. There really is hope, because we have no other choice. We're a resilient, stubborn species, human beings. We want to live.
So Dr. Fold, if I could segue back to the university, since I am part of your university, I would think we would follow up on this in terms of the role that you've mentioned, plus educating the next generation of leaders, the people who will be here in 2021, not just 2050, to deal with whatever we leave behind, this generation in the 20th century. But I'll just set that aside as an editorial comment. I'd like to turn to something most people are always interested in when I've been in conversations about these broad, important issues, which is, how does one find their way to sustainability, the inspiration? And I want to ask each one of you about your own personal, if you will, path to sustainability. And I want to start with Nigel, Nigel, we know least about you in this city. We know a little bit about the mayor and President Fold, but yourself, how did you find your way to this issue?
I've always had a fascination for cold places. It's a kind of a British thing. You know, we had these mad explorers who went to the North Pole and the South Pole in the late 19th, early 20th century, and my father spent some time in Iceland and Spitsbergen as a young man. So I was a climber as a young man, and I spent some time in Greenland, in Iceland, and Patagonia. And in the late 80s, I saw climate change happening, right? Like, I saw glaciers that were on a map that didn't exist. So I mean, for me, it's the combination of a love of wild places, and then as I've grown older, a sense of responsibility to future generations. I mean, I just think I could get very angry if we spend enough time talking about it, thinking at just how appallingly we are letting down future generations. Not just the kids today, but think 2, 3, 5 generations, 10 generations down the track. So there's an inspiration from nature, and there's a strong sense of injustice, and that's both just intergenerational injustice and, within cities, within nations, between nations, we have huge levels of inequality, and climate is both a ecological crisis, but it's also a crisis of injustice. And that's one of the reasons I'm so thrilled that the C40 under the mayor's leadership has really embraced this issue of resilience. So for me, the COP needs to be about action, yes, but also solidarity, because there is one route to action which just has, nice net zero lifestyles and dirt poor net zero lifestyles. So, and we have to have much more of a rising tide that lifts all boats here. Maybe an inappropriate climate metaphor, yeah, I'd say love of nature and a plea for justice and solidarity.
Every time I think of that question, I probably could get a different answer, because I think for all of us, you start thinking about all the parts in your life where at this moment seem to be coming together. And a little bit like Nigel's, I grew up not in a wild place. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, but there was a little park behind my house that I thought was the most wonderful place in the world. You could climb trees, you could slide down hills, you got to pick up rocks and you'd see bugs. I mean, this was, I think, hugely formative for me. And it's been why when I grew older and became aware of wild places, they just left me breathless how important they were. But it's why I know even in an urban environment, you can feel an incredible affinity with nature. In fact, I've never met a child, no matter who they are, that doesn't stop and listen to a bird singing, that wouldn't like to have a tree in their front yard. So I think it's that blending of that just mystery and beauty of the natural world that can be both wild and majestic or right in your backyard that just made me love it. And I think also, like Nigel, as I began to work on it, the agency, being a scientist working on discovery is fabulous. But what I loved about sustainability is it was associated with doing something. It took all the great learnings I had, and the job was to try to make things last, make them sustainable, give some equity as a major part of your goal. And that is such a vision for today, that we are bringing everything to bear, and we're making the tent, we're bringing in everyone. It's a diversity, it's social equity, and it's the preservation of what makes the world such a special place. So I think sustainability has just been the real unifier for me of many things that I've loved in my life.
Thank you. Mayor Garcia.
So I grew up in a wild place too, called Los Angeles, where coyotes cross the street and you see deer in people's backyards, where you can walk the LA River and certainly see the coastline and gaze into tide pools. But for me, the environment has never just been about the environment. It's also been about equity. I was raised with the idea that we should fight for justice. And I think it's the flip side of this thing. This isn't just about biodiversity. This is about how we live as human beings, because the earth will long outsurvive us. It's whether we will survive on it. I think three things kind of catalyzed my work on environment. One was the three S's, I'll call them. Service, I learned from the tree people, my first internship in high school, and getting those hands literally dirty and planting trees, not just in the hills, but in the urban areas of Los Angeles, and understanding how a tree retained water and provided shade, and all the things now that as mayor, when I look at things like shade as an equity issue and where we plant them to help a senior in South LA who's overheating, or a student who doesn't want to do homework because she was so hot waiting for the bus. I think that's where service was planted. Then in college, and Dr. Fulcher, forgive me, but I wanted the easy science class that I could find at Columbia. So I took Wallace Broker's class. He was the man who first termed global warming. It was in 1989 or 90. It was the year of the first IPCC. I remember being in class and he said, this just came out from the UN, but it was called Design and Maintenance of a Habitable Planet. That was the name of his course, which still is what we're doing today, trying to design and to maintain a habitable planet. That introduced the science for me. And then I think it was time that I spent in the jungles of Burma, just as I graduated college, where the third S, the scope of this, hit home, where I was working with democratic resistance in the jungles of Burma after the first crackdown by that authoritarian government, something very resonant right now. But while I lived in the jungle, this dense, beautiful tropical rainforest, alongside other activists I met who worked for Greenpeace and other places, I realized that you couldn't just do this in your backyard. There was a global scope to this. So those things prepared me for one day when I was suddenly in charge of a Department of Water and Power and a sanitation bureau and a port and an airport and the third busiest metro system in the country, that I had a perspective of understanding that the three E's really of ecology or environment, economy, and equity from those seeds planted long ago.
Well, you know, as I listen to this, I want to just say that I've been involved in this myself, just academically and professionally and personally for several decades. And I've been in many a meeting and panel. And I want to say, I think this was, in this tight time frame we've had, one of the more informational panels and inspirational that I have had the pleasure of participating in this case, moderating. So I want to thank all three of our participants. And I think that the summit and everybody at the summit today is going to walk away saying, we know why we're here. We know what we need to do. Let's get to work. So I want to thank all three of you very much.
Thank you, Dan.